Hello and welcome. This video is going to be a stream of consciousness where I kind of share my thoughts on how I like to think about large language models, understanding the technique of exploration. Okay, so let's start off by using some notes that I drew. As you can see in the video, we start by saying, okay, large language model signposts. And I thought that this was relevant because in crafting this, I thought to myself, okay, well, what do I know about large language models? How do I approach using them? And is my to what about my experience can I share that's of value, and how can I communicate that? So I thought I'd start by kind of writing this out. So let me kind of walk you through what this means to me. Okay, large language model signpost. I started that because it's like, okay, signposts, it's a useful kind of signifier, but to start, it's quotes. It's the grammar of it, right? You could just say large language model, put a comma, put a semicolon, signposts, or you can chop up what's being said, you can put quotes, and that will have a different output on the model. Just to start off, I do recommend books on grammar. For me, Rhetorical Grammar by Martha Colin, the fourth edition, has been useful. Actually, I've written, it's like, in my mind, I want to say that grammar is the unconscious bedrock for large language models. So it's like it's a really crucial thing to kind of think about and to use if you have any books on grammar to kind of just go and test in and test out some of those concepts. Okay, so let's start. I write, what is a large language model? And then open parentheses, explain this within the context of next token prediction. Okay, so this is where I start. If you were, getting started out, okay, what is a large language model? How do you go through that process? The first thing that I would do when you see a solid square, that means you should try that exact prompt, right? So you would type in, what is a large language model? And then in parentheses, explain this within the context of next token prediction. So that's really important to give you a baseline. Like, really, can you answer that question? What is a large language model? A large language model is blank, 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 right? Now, this is an interesting sort of conceptualization because I'm like, oh yeah, I'm saying it, but I'm like, oh, I'm not explaining what a large language model is in this context, right? These are signposts to use. So I find that to be interesting in the context of, okay, so we're talking about you interacting with a large language model. Like, what are you looking to get out of the model, and how are you going through the semantic space to be able to find what you're looking for, right? So, even if I gave a pretty good definition, I cited my sources, maybe I reframed the question. Could you explain a large language model uh, to a 5-year-old, to a 10-year-old, to a 15-year-old? Can you explain a large language model from a specific profession, maybe from a specific generational perspective, right? But that's kind of going into the weeds. We're still saying, okay, well, what is a large language model, right? And in the note, I put, this prompt can be shortened or expanded using independent clauses contained within parentheses, brackets, curly braces, and angled brackets. Now, that was really important in the context of this as a starting point prompt to use. Like, what is a large language model? And like, how do you go about framing the question to look for that with which you're searching for, right? So many different ways to kind of frame that. And most importantly, when you start adding parentheses, when you start using quotes, we kind of want to think of quotes as like a highlight, but I don't have the language to describe, okay, quotes as a highlight versus parentheses as kind of subtext within a clause. Like, okay, what is a large language model? Comma versus versus a M dash versus a colon. All of these kind of different permutations will get you different results. And it also conditions the model in terms of its expectations for you as a consumer as you're working with it, right? So it's like it's a large context, chain of thought. All of that kind of goes to condition the context window to the extent that you can kind of keep track of that or find value in it. So next we say, compare and contrast this model to establish a contextual feel for RHLF, reinforcement, human learning feedback, something like that, where it's like they're adding in sort of different guardrails and in order to sort of condition the model from a red teaming perspective, but also to let you know, like, oh, I'm just talking into a large language model, right? To kind of give you more useful feedback, or at least feedback that they think is a better technical baseline or synthetic baseline for like the consumers of the model, of whatever model you're using, whether that be an open source model, whether that be GPT 3.5, GPT 4, GPT 4.0, Llama 3, and various others use cases. But I start here because this is a good foot in the door to kind of start, okay, what is, right? And we could go on a philosophical note about can you really say what something is, but that's a side point when you're looking for a response within the context of next token prediction. Can you front run the next token based on what you're saying to provide more context for it to feed in terms of it gaining access to the latent space within the model as exemplified when it's speaking to you, producing an output? In a few slides, I say input is just as important as output, but we'll pick that up later. Okay, so this as a baseline prompt. Okay, and then compare. Okay, so you could say the same prompt, right? Just as structured here, precisely. And then you could chop it up. Maybe you could add more context, more sentences, more details. Maybe you could say, okay, well, I'm focusing on this specific thing, so let me add some quotes. I just want to mess around, so let me add parentheses versus brackets. Let me add brackets versus parentheses. And you can try that as a contextual difference. And uh, you can notice how that changes over the course of time. Now, I'm using that as a kind of a segue because it goes into, in the later parts of this paper, we talk about context window. So we're saying based on the context window, right? This is the total tokens that a large language model can process at a time. This determines how much information the large language model can remember from the previous text. So, based on this context, I want you to frame intent based on early game, mid game, and end game. So, what does this mean? This means whenever you start a new chat window. Now this was built before kind of I had a thought process around custom instructions or custom GPTs. So when you're using custom instructions and custom GPTs, that's going to free up a lot of room in terms of the early game context window, because it's going to provide that context by taking up some of that early game context window. So okay, so do you understand what I'm saying? I'm saying based on the context window of a specific large language model. In this instance, we're saying that the context window is 32,000. So this means we would try to divide it by 3 into early game, mid game, and and end game. So early game is where you would go up to the top and you would start, okay, well, what is a large language model? Okay, well, what is math? What is, okay, can you speak as a, all of these different things. We actually do recommend kind of getting your foot in the door in terms of jailbreaking, just so you can get a sense of the model's capability and like how the model responds to your attempts to jailbreak it in specific contexts, so that you can understand, well, if you assume that it's in the model already, how do you get there? Do you it Can you find a book? Can you find a concept from a book? Can you pre-buffer that as information that's relevant, and then pre-buffer other information and then compare and contrast it? This gets into a concept where it's like prompting versus feeding. In the early days, when people were trying to understand, okay, what are large language models, how do they work, from the technical side, in terms of prompt engineering, you had a lot of different things. uh, Contrastive chain of thought prompting, chain of thought prompting, zero shot prompting, where it's just like, okay, I'm sending a prompt, I expect, what I want out of that prompt. Chain of thought, I'm like, okay, I'm asking question, but then that question's read is just as important as write. So it's like, just with the question, with also the output, now I can further respond, not just based on the context of what I asked in terms of my question, but also in the context of what was produced as an output, because that also implies the activated latent space in relation to the model. So early game is really important in terms of, are you prompting into the model? Similarly, if you're building custom GPT, prompting into the model based on what you would like to have it do for you and perform for you, versus feeding. So prompting versus feeding. Feeding just being you're copying and pasting text that may or may not be relevant into the model, and that's activating latent space based on the text that you have put into the model, and then you can kind of work sometimes, like, unless you're like really doing like heavy, like, okay, so am I working on prompt engineering? Let's do a zero shot. Okay, now let's walk through the steps of what I'm looking for so that we can get a better output, versus just saying, okay, well, I'm looking for information about a book or this concept. I already have a website or some sort of copy, some sort of text that's relevant to it. Let me just copy and paste that into the model, and then we can work from there. That pretty much would constitute early game, where you're just setting up your intent, you're setting up the context so that the model has a technical baseline to work with, and then you move into mid game, right? But this is important because the context window is based on tokens. So you really need to understand, okay, so I'm talking to the model, maybe I'm feeding text. How many tokens have I used, right? In a in another slide, we say, okay, can you annotate the last 10 queries with token amounts per request? So that's important because you can actually kind of have it request. Now, right, since this is still generative, I don't know that I would 100% like take it. Okay, well, yeah, no, it's the exact token count. But this as a conditioning mechanism does help kind of even out sort of your expectations and the model's expectations, to the extent where it's like, okay, well, I asked like a whole paragraph of a question and it's telling me that's like 170 tokens, versus I just did a response and that's like 15 tokens. So in terms of, where do you start with zero information, how I like to think about large language models, this is important. This is your currency within this realm. I heard an estimate that said a token is about 75% of a word, right? So when you have a word, you might have some consonants, some vowels, this model, I'm trying to context. So maybe con and maybe text are two different tokens, right? So depending on the word, depending on the model, it might chop up those words in different pieces, parts that influences the generation in terms of the model weights. But to double back to mid game, right? So you're feeding and you're saying, okay, well, I fed a lot. I don't know if based on me just feeding so much text in that if it already got me into end game or if I'm still in mid game, but you can kind of get a baseline on that by asking it to recall how many tokens have been used or maybe just the last 10, just so you can keep track of that in order for you to understand, like, okay, so what tokens are being used. Okay, so to double back, subject, object, verb versus subject, verb, object. This goes back to the importance of grammar within how you think about utilizing large language models. As an English speaker, we normally think in terms of subject, verb, object. The boy is going to the school. The subject, the person, is traveling to a place. In other languages, they might use subject, object, verb. This is an important distinction to note in terms of maybe fundamentals about how large language models work, but also their intersection with languages in general. But I'm only including this as a signpost because this is something to explore within large language models. Talk to it and have it give examples in the different types. Ask for questions, ask for responses, ask for it to communicate this to you with from different perspectives, as a large language model, as a specific occupation. On this channel, we recommend using assume the persona of. So have it assume the persona of a specific character. We've also seen similar results from when you ask it to act as a firefighter and try to provide some fire safety information, right? You're just exploring the context of what is included within the model at this point in time. And again, you never want to think of it as just a pure prompting operation, because that's kind of very tedious and it could send you just different sort of, that's your technical baseline. But once you establish that intent, you can always go to a search engine and find information about firefighting after you had it assume the persona of a firefighter, and then copy and paste that information into the large language model, and that's going to better condition its expectations, but also tapping into the latent space of what it assumes to be its baseline for how it purports to represent itself as any given occupation. So this is important when you're looking to get subject matter expertise from any field. In terms of prompting into it, you want to prompt into it to activate that latent space in terms of shortening that connective thread for those nuanced cultural details that only that specific subject matter expert may know. And you can get there through direct prompting if you can understand sort of the chain of thought necessary to activate that latent space, or you can mix it up by walking through that process and then also feeding and then doubling back, feeding a little bit more, etc, etc. So just with that example, we were like, okay, feeding and then mid game. So now you're looking for results or output in the mid game. You're saying, okay, well, um, yeah, I was gonna say maybe your house burned down, or maybe you were looking for information about wildlife, local wildlife. So you're saying, okay, maybe a park ranger, or maybe maybe a biologist that spent time within the specific region that you're looking for, the specific flora and fauna. This is another point on technical language use, which is why we bring up the concept of feeding. The more technical language use you can kind of reference, that does go to activate the latent semantic space for what you're looking for. So if you're saying, okay, I want a botanist um, that knows about this specific tree frog, um, you can do that to walk through it, but if you already kind of know that what you're looking for, then it does make sense to just copy and paste like the scientific name for the specific creature, maybe a little bit of technique about how they go about like studying this field, because when you um, read is just as important as write. So as it's producing information back to you to say, okay, well, yeah, this is what's going on, that sort of hyper technical language use activates that, right? Because who would be using that language? Is that a regular person that's like, oh yeah, the Cornelius tree frog? No, no, no. It's the person in that specific occupation that's going to be like, okay, this is a blank, 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 the scientific jargon for the specific species. And then you can zoom out, you can go to the order, you can say, okay, what's the history between how this order was described, how this relates to other different types of species of tree frog, etc. Right? So that's all in the section for looking for results or outputs, but it's also in the context of you understanding where you're at in terms of early game, mid game, and end game. You could already be in end game still looking for results, but then the the context window from the early game starts to slip out. So unless there's enough buffer in between, you might lose some interesting or important information in terms of what you're expecting, because you're expecting the context window to have information from early game, and then it's bleeding out because you've already gotten into end game. And this is interesting. I don't know if many people go over this, but I like this is why I like to break it down into these sections, because endgame is a specific area. It's very interesting because you can have the model produce for you after action reports with token counts. And it can actually give you like a call and response feedback, like, okay, so like what was I doing here? Like for me as the user, how would you project my intent? Like what was the point of this entire context window? Was I trying to solve a problem? Was I exploring? You can actually ask these questions to the model and kind of engage in a call and response feedback where you can close that object subject gap in between, like, okay, but wait, like, oh, the model is saying that it thought that my intent was to like produce a report, but I was just exploring. So you can use this information in the future. But this is a really important thing to be able to utilize to get that sort of that subjective feedback from the model as you try to say, okay, but like, can you inquire into my intent? What was going on? Do you have anything that we might improve based on the intent that I'm espousing, based on uh, based on any uh, like assumed personas that the model has taken on? Maybe you're working in a teaching capacity, so you're trying to learn a specific subject. So this model is acting as a tutor. Maybe this model is acting as a blank, or it's assuming the persona of a specific occupation. Maybe you're having it assume this persona and then biject that and assumed another persona, and you're having these personas discuss amongst themselves from their perspectives based on what you're saying, and you're kind of playing an intermediate role. This is where I'm saying, okay, how I would like to think about large language models. I'm kind of exploring this space here. So again, in terms of endgame, you can iterate suggestions for improvement, right? So like, hey, in Endgame, right, it's important in this framing because since we're still in Endgame within this example, you can actually go back as early game, back to when the original premises were established, or in mid game if there were divergences, and you can kind of track the continuity, or you can inquire into the continuity, like what changed in my intent as we started from early game, and what did that imply when I switched the topic, right? So you can kind of like based on the information that it's giving you as feedback, you can say, oh, okay, this will help structure your understanding for not only how you seek to engage with large language models, but also to create a synthetic baseline for like the large language model itself in terms of your expectations. Okay, so where do you start with zero information? Solid square equals try exact prompt. Note the note. It's important because grammar is everything, right? A basic prompt can be shortened or expanded using clauses. Clauses in quotes, important. Use quotes as a highlight. Test out the difference between quotes, parentheses, brackets, curly braces. Test out the difference between parentheses, brackets, curly braces. Compare and contrast. Sometimes use parentheses, sometimes use brackets, sometimes only use parentheses, only use brackets. Sometimes find something of value. Again, go into the grammar. What is a parentheses? What is a bracket? How is it being used in grammar? Transfer that into the large language model and use this as a conditioning syntax for structuring your intent, and then teach it, educate it. Say, okay, in this context, I use parentheses for this versus that. Ask it, what do you think about my use of parentheses, or how is this model trained in relation to its use of grammar? Very, very important. So, and we also discussed context window length. Okay, next, where do you start with zero information? Solid square equals try exact prompt. Okay, so we're starting this again, right? This is a starting prompt. What is a user interface? Right? So in this, I wrote chain of thought prompting. So it's like, what is a user interface? What is a user interface walkthrough? Okay, so we actually have an example where we kind of included some snippets. This is where this is actually from a ChatGPT encounter where we were discussing with the model and we said, okay, what is a user interface walkthrough? So the model was like, okay, a user interface walkthrough is a guided tour of a user interface, typically presented in a linear fashion. Okay, so this is important, one, because this was my starting point. So I'm saying I already kind of have a background in thinking about user interfaces. So the hardest part about all of this is understanding your technical baseline, right? Like if you wouldn't even know that this was a question to ask, that's an important consideration as you kind of stair step your way, right? Because it's all about making sense to you as a consumer. But at the same time, if you really want the best out of a large language model, then you're going to want that subject matter expertise. So it can speak to you to make things make sense at different reading levels, different age levels, different levels of experience. But you're definitely going to want to use that as a technical baseline and then scale that up to include subject matter expertise that can be ported back to your current level of understanding. Okay, so that was the first question. What is a user interface walkthrough? And then okay, so yeah, typically presented in a linear fashion, it's designed to help users understand how to use the interface and navigate through it. A user interface walkthrough is typically presented to users when they first use a product or service, and it may be offered as a tutorial. Okay, so it's like explaining that. And then the next was list 10 different ways someone might explain the ChatGPT OpenAI user interface in the context of a new user getting to interact with the platform. All right, so it produced 10 different ways someone might explain the ChatGPT user interface to a new user. And that was really important for a multitude of reasons. Pause. Okay, so we're picking back up where we left off. These were some visualizations for this point, which is specifically, okay, where do you start with zero information and how do I like to think about large language models? So these questions are questions, but they should also be viewed as prompts. Okay, so number two, list 10 different ways someone might explain ChatGPT open AI user interface in the context of a new user getting to interact with the platform. So let's try to break down that prompt. List 10. Lists are important. You can also use tables. I like to use tables as well. Bullet points and markdown format. Codex is in there, so you can use different coding languages. You can also use mermaid syntax if you like to view things in terms of mind maps. Right? So list 10. Okay, so we're getting 10 in a list, different ways versus similar ways. Someone, who's this someone? But it's still someone, might explain, might explain the ChatGPT OpenAI user interface, comma, right? Double commas. Maybe that's useful, maybe that's not useful. See if there's a difference. Understand what that intent might be behind how the model is structuring it based on, okay, well, I use the colon, I actually use the semicolon. Oh, there's a difference. Is there a difference? Is it important? Why? And kind of working through that in the context of a new user getting to interact with the platform. So we actually had a note. We said every token counts, and then parentheses for something, close parentheses. You'll get different weights based on context of em dash or hyphen, punctuation, placement. So let's go back to this example here, where it's telling us stuff, and then we're saying continue. Oh no, I think we moved a bit too quick. Okay, so still on number 2, this is chain of thought, right? So it's like it's different because we could say, okay, what is a user interface walkthrough? And that might be a zero-shot prompt. Like you might just end there, versus you might start with list 10 different ways, right? But you might start with number 2, right? Using those in isolation would be viewed as a zero-shot prompt, as opposed to when you're, okay, let's start here and then follow up and then follow up 3 questions in succession. Think of that as a form of chain of thought prompting. So we write, if an output stops generating mid-sentence, say continue or continue with the paragraph, with the above paragraph from, and then include colons. So this was just some early game stuff in terms of when your responses might get cut off and you're like, what do I do, right? Because every word kind of conditions the next token. So if you're saying, okay, if you're writing a whole paragraph, just say continue, that's going to add stuff into it, as opposed to just saying continue, but maybe it didn't understand what it was supposed to continue from. That's been reduced over the course of time, but it's still an important thing to kind of understand in terms of like the history of our interaction with these platforms. So number 3, provide an outline for a 15-minute YouTube video explaining token counts, prompt engineering, text summarization, creating lists, creating tables, the concept of assuming personas, and how large language models relate to the field of grammar. So in asking that prompt, that pretty much like is the coup de grace of how I like to think about large language models, at least at the outset. So if you take a look at this, we're saying, okay, so we said explaining token counts, right? Explain what token counts are and how they're used in large language models. Explain. So if you actually went through this process and it actually produced this as an output, you could actually just take some of these snippets from the outline and you could plug that back in. This is like micro feeding, right? So if it gives you a good enough output, you can always copy and paste that output back into the model and get a response. So token counts, really important. Prompt engineering, really important, back to grammar. Very, very important. Text summarization. There are different types of text summarization that the model specializes in, or just to understand, like, what is text summarization? How does that apply to natural language processing? And what can be done within that context? This is important in terms of me kind of working through and explaining how I like to think about large language models. Creating lists and tables. Again, tables, highly underrated. Lists, very important to use, very useful. and then assuming personas or acting it to act as a, or in the context of red, you can actually have it act as a Linux terminal. You can have it act as a software debugging. You can have it assume the persona of a subject matter expert. You could have it assume the persona of somebody that you know, and then feed in information that you think might close that object subject gap to the extent where you're like, oh, well, that really does sound like them, or that's how they would respond. But again, that takes a lot of feeding and also understanding the technical baseline of where the model is at, because it might not want to respond in that context. You know, from the early days, the classic, oh, I'm just a large language model, things of that nature. Okay, understanding. Okay, so let's double back. Okay, so note for chain of thought number 3, we use the enter key to create a coding line break. Okay, so that's important. I said for number 3, provide an outline for a 15-minute YouTube video. And then we added a colon, and then we actually pressed the enter button for a line break. So this is actually really crucial, because similarly to grammar itself, but there's also a in the background of like Python, or just how your text gets inputted into the system. You could just write a full paragraph, just a block of text, and put that into the model. You could also take each of those lines where there's a sentence and a period, and then shift enter, right, to create a line break for each one of those sentences. And again, that produces different results. And you want to get a feel for your intent. If you're just, okay, I'm just putting bulk information in here, versus, okay, this is somewhat different. So let me use bulk information, and let me actually do a line break, and maybe let's do a colon, and then do parentheses, and maybe actually we add um, curly braces to include that bulk text and the colon and the other parentheses, but then include something, maybe like something else at the bottom, right? So all of this contributes to your end goal in terms of what you receive, right? So it's one thing to just say, okay, I'm looking for something, I'm asking for it, I'm using the right language. But in order for you to understand the large language model and condition that in a way that gives you the most flexibility over the output that you receive, whether that be getting quote unquote better outputs, getting more impactful outputs, all of these different things, these grammar and these formatting differences contribute a lot to the end product. And more importantly, they stack over time. So something from early game can show up in mid game and end game that it wouldn't otherwise show up in a static model where you, okay, I'm starting a new chat window and none of that context is included. So what do we, okay, well, right? So again, this example, provide an outline, and then we did colon, right? So that's interesting, right? You could format this in all types of different ways, right? You could not use a colon. You could just use a line break and then include the rest in parentheses. You could switch it up, and you get different outputs, right? But you, as the content consumer, as the person interacting with the large language model, you need to understand that difference as like a sixth sense, so that you can understand, okay, well, I might just be interacting with this in a way, I'm just blasting, I'm using text to search for what I'm looking for, to activate the semantic space, to kind of get the intent to provide the output that I want. But if you don't know that difference, that differential, where it's like, okay, well, maybe I should use the colon. Maybe let's try like highlighting this in parentheses, right? You have to understand that as a sixth sense in terms of the underlying grammar for whatever large language model that you're using, because it will definitely increase your ability to interact with the model itself. Okay, so yeah, you get different results from using bulk text paragraphs versus moving to the next line or adding a space as a token buffer, right? So I guess in this context, I'm referring to spaces and enters and line breaks as token buffers, right? Because I don't actually know if a space is actually a computable token versus like when they say, okay, take time to think. Like if you actually just input a whole bunch of M dashes in between uh, a subject and a predicate, and then you said, okay, well, those as like filler text, right? Maybe a backslash, maybe a plus, maybe a equal, like different symbols within the keyboard where it's like, okay, it means nothing, but maybe it's acting as a token buffer so that it's giving the large language model more time to process the synthetic space as opposed to, okay, I'm just asking a question specifically versus I'm asking a question, okay, token buffer, token buffer, token buffer. Maybe that token buffer provides it more space to quote unquote think or to quote unquote process other heuristics that may contribute to a better output. So again, you have to explore that for yourself to get a sense of that as you kind of want to try that out. And again, can you annotate the last 10 queries with token amounts per request? Highly crucial, solid square. Try that as an exact prompt. The model will give you an output to say, okay, well, based on these prompts that you have input, these last queries, these are the token amounts. So you can kind of get a sense of, okay, well, what am I saying exactly? Oh, this is what I'm getting back from the model. It's saying this question were contained these tokens versus this versus these, right? And don't assume that it's like 100% accurate, but use it to create a synthetic baseline to give you a point of reference. Okay, next, where do you start with zero information? Okay, for this, we're continuing where we left off in the last slide, and we're saying, okay, create a table for technical specifications involving prompt engineering. Pause. Okay, so for this example, we asked it to create a table, create it for what? The technical specifications involving prompt engineering. So, right, this is just a sentence, but break down each different clause, create a table. Why? For the what? Technical specifications involving prompt engineering. In this case, we don't actually have an image, but the response that I got when I tried this originally was, okay, it said prompt length. Length of prompt measured in characters or words. Vocabulary size. The number of words in the prompt. This can be used to measure the complexity of the language used in the prompt. Grammatical structure. The grammatical structure of the prompt, including sentence structure, verb tense, and the use of nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. Spelling and punctuation. The correct use of spelling and punctuation in the prompt. Clarity and conciseness. The clarity and conciseness of the prompt, including the use of simple, clear language and the avoidance of unnecessary words or phrases. Style and tone. The style and tone of the prompt, including the use of formal or informal language, and the overall tone of the prompt, persuasive, informative, etc. Cultural appropriateness. The appropriateness of the prompt for different cultural contexts, including the use of language and references that are appropriate and respectful for different cultures. Personalization. The use of personalized language and references in the prompt, such as the use of the user's name or other personalized information. Contextual relevance, the relevance of the prompt to the user's current context, including the use of language and references that are appropriate and meaningful in the user's current situation. Accessibility, the accessibility of the prompt for users with disabilities, including the use of language and formatting that is accessible to users with visual, auditory, or other impairments. So that for the next part, we asked how many different ways can this, right? Okay, so how many, how many different ways can this large language model summarize text? So from that, and again, all of these are examples to use to actually ask the large language model itself, right? This is a synthetic baseline. We're providing a prompt to use, chain of thought, put one after the next, switch up the grammar, switch up the syntax, switch up the adverbs, compare and contrast. And we said, okay, how many different ways can it summarize text? And then we did next line, right? So we're using a line break. And we're saying provide advanced technical details related to the current version of ChatGPT. And so from that, it produced an explanation that included extractive summarization. Yeah, extract to extract, extractive summarization, abstract, like an abstract, abstractive summarization. Number 3, sentence compression. And number 4, keyword extraction. So I'm sure there are others, but that's a great place to start. And next we asked the model, okay, are there any capabilities adjacent, okay, so we use the word like adjacent, capabilities adjacent to extractive summarization, abstractive summarization, sentence compression, and keyword extraction that may be useful to be informed about, open parentheses, outside of text summarization, close parentheses, question mark. This was a great example to use because it's one of the first times that we used parentheses so that you get a sense of how I might think about the use of a certain clause in this respect, but also how you can kind of experiment in your own capacity if you decide to use this prompt. So again, the response that we got was, okay, there are different additional capabilities, and they listed them down. They said 1, text generation, 2, text classification, 3, named entity recognition, 4, part of speech tagging, 5, dependency parsing, 6, information extraction. And those were really interesting to use. Okay, so next, in the fourth prompt that we used in terms of chain of thought, we said elaborate on text classification, part of speech tagging, and dependency parsing. So just from the chain of thought that we had, now we're saying, okay, we'll elaborate on these specific instances. Okay, so again, let's start from the beginning. We're saying this is how I like to think about large language models, but also how do you even begin to understand what a large language model is or how to understand it? I can kind of try to give a blast to kind of uh, create a focal point as a lensing effect, but really you're not really going to be able to understand it until you get that the sense of that object subject confirmation in between you prompting into the model and getting responses that you're looking for. For me, I'm always going to want to find the top length of like how can I get the most valuable technical language that I like as a content consumer. I really value hypergraph references. So when I'm consuming content on YouTube, some of the most memorable experiences for me is when I don't understand something or I've heard of a new word or phrase in a video, and then I can actually search that as a hypergraph edge, as a hypergraph reference, and then find content on that where it's like, oh wow, well now I'm getting exposed to new content creators. Now I actually understand what this is, so it can be layered within my understanding. But this is like, okay, this is a baseline for large language models. So for some people, it's just like, okay, I'm using this for work. I'm using this for schooling. I'm using this in my own personal capacity. I'm using this to educate myself. So it's like always that intent, right? So you could just have it, you could say whatever, and it could give you like, okay, well, you're using big words right now. So like, explain this to me like a 16-year old, or explain this to me an 11th grade reading level. And that's useful for you to understand that about yourself personally. But the reason why I bring that up is that in many respects, I'm this is not an assumption, it's an expectation. The more technical language that you can feed, and read is just as important as write. You can use that to activate the latent space on. It's one thing to say, okay, well, we're talking about math, we're explaining it to a fifth grader, okay, but it's another thing to say, okay, well, why is a number a number? Why is like to go into deep theory, to conjure those people, those essences, that semantic space that has that detail, those details of that in-depth theory. In order for you to close that gap, you have to prompt into it to imply that you're looking for the nth level of whatever this model holds to be able to use. Because if you just want information and input, it's going to give you a technical synthetic baseline based on how OpenAI structures its models to interact with the general public, but also as that progresses, how the general public is interacting, and it creates a technical synthetic baseline that may not display the breadth of the value that a model can produce, because you're just like, okay, well, let me talk to it regularly, as opposed to saying, okay, well, let's feed some technical subject matter, right? Like at this point, actually, I would recommend dictionaries. If you have a field of study that you're interested in, or if you're looking for data to feed into the model, specialized dictionaries for whatever you're looking for, highly recommended, right? Because again, when you're feeding into that, or you're activating that, or you're requesting it, all of the read is just as important as write. So it's activating that latent space that you can use, and you might not even know that that's like possible, or that's like a part of the experience, because you might just say, okay, well, I just talk to me, just make it make sense, just write all the, like, you're just trying to have a regular conversation, right? But in order to get the most out of these large language models, you really do have to activate the most relevant latent semantic space to be able to establish that hook, but then to also hook it into other disparate fields. Because once that hook has been established, you can always compare and contrast that to other fields of study. And if the hook has been established with enough context and breadth and information and value, you can have that compare and contrast that's nth orders better than just saying, okay, well, explain physics, or explain YouTube playlists, explain content consumption. Going in and finding those technical baselines, creating a buyer persona for an assimilated persona or heuristic that a large language model can assume, and then interact with a subject matter expert in physics with a layman, how they might interact, and compare and contrast that to like early Greek literature. and say, oh, wow, well, it was just a random compare and contrast, but this is providing unique insights because the context was strong enough that when you activated a disparate semantic space, latent semantic space, that combinatoric interaction produces value nth times, as opposed to just talk to me about Greek history, all these things. But again, I'm just sharing my thoughts on how I like to think about large language models. We just finished up this section on elaborate on text classification, part of speech tagging and dependency parsing. Okay, so this is where next we will go into the concept of feeding the model and activating latent space. So I think in previous sections we did well enough to go into that, to kind of really try to give you a baseline for how I understand the concept of feeding the model in relation to activating latent space. Okay, so next we write, starting a session without context requires you to pre-buffer the necessary heuristics to narrow the wide space of potential next token activation. Have it write explanations and expand through examples, alternatives, suggestions, compare and contrast differences. Okay, so yeah, that's it. That's really important. I'm gonna have to harp on this. Starting a session without context. That's early game, without custom instructions, without a custom GPT. With those things, it already gives you access to that pre-buffer. But without it, it requires you to pre-buffer the necessary heuristics to narrow the wide space of potential next token activation. Very important, because from the moment you start a session, that sort of starts narrowing the space of combinatoric possibilities. Still wide, but saying the versus a versus beginning versus end versus in another language versus talking only in the first person versus the third person. All these things start that funnel effect where it's creating a lensing effect. So you need to be conscious of that lensing effect in relation to how the model is responding to you, but also in relation to your intent. Maybe you want to throw audible and you want to switch it up. Maybe you want to try to bifurcate it because it's giving you context within a specific lens. And then you say, okay, well, can we bifurcate this? Assume this context, but then write something else where it's like different. We might have to go over that in another video. Okay, have it write explanations and expand through examples. Okay, examples like taps into the latent semantic space, right? Because read is just as important as write, but it also gives you a sense of like where the large language model is coming from, because in it giving examples, you're saying, okay, well, what? Out of all the examples, this is the example you're giving me? Should we change that? Is that good? Like you get that context with regard to the examples that it's giving. And then you say, okay, well, technical synthetic baseline for the examples. Okay, can I get alternatives? Why do you want alternatives? Are you telling the large language model that like your examples weren't good enough to be used for the context that you wanted? Are you just saying you want variety? All these things kind of condition the model, but also condition you in terms of your expectations. So you always want to be managing like, oh, no, this is not the intent that I had. I would like you to do something differently, versus also like, but wait, why would the model respond like that? Like what's going on with the semantic space around this? You can kind of use that to, again, to better condition your understanding. Suggestions, compare and contrast, one of my favorite reference points. Compare and contrast, especially when, like, now that you can compare and contrast disparate fields and have them like, okay, well, but what is this random field of let's say analytical idealism versus nominalism and realism versus culture commentary, right? Like you can get technical synthetic baselines and then say, okay, well, compare and contrast these thoughts. How might somebody like a practitioner in the field, how might they present these ideas, things of that nature? Differences are always good. And then again, I said that pre-buffer or feed the model using text. to shape the latent default space by narrowing the next possible token. Okay, so starting a session without context requires you to pre-buffer. So we said that, and then it was like this. All of this first section was just to expand that latent semantic space, to activate it based on not only what you put into the model, but also how you react to what the model has said. Sometimes you should make sure you to clarify that you are in favor of versus not in favor of whatever the response was, because again, that helps to condition the future token space. And that's saying, okay, starting a session, okay, early game in that context versus early game with just feeding the model, copying and pasting previous prompts, previous responses, text from the internet, your text from websites and web pages, text from books, stuff of that nature, right? That's feeding the model, right? Bulk, copy and paste, relevant text, extremely, extremely important. At this point, it's probably, unless you're like doing technical dev work to understand how you understand prompt engineering, if you're really just looking for like the intent of an output because you want to solve something, to understand something, I would definitely recommend using bulk, feeding the model bulk text that's relevant. Okay, so an example. Can you add two columns with additional information which is relevant slash germane slash coextensive slash concomitant? Now that this is important because again, tables are really, really valuable. But also you can add columns, right? So say you're just saying, okay, I'm talking about something, blah, 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 blah. But you can also say, okay, well, actually, add some columns with like adjacent information. Add columns with information which is, relevant, germane, coextensive, concomitant, right? This uses a table to explore unknown space within the context of your session interaction. So again, this is just a really useful example to show how, with whatever you're working on, all you have to do is say, okay, well, add some columns with new information that's relevant to what we're talking about. And that allows you to focus on what you're working on, but also has it be able to tap into this adjacent space where you might find value in it because it's giving you information you can use, but you also might find value in it because you can learn something about the model and about how you want to further structure this because of the information that you're given. You can say, oh, whoa, I'm using this in my end product versus, okay, well, it kind of gave me some like whack information, but like I didn't even know that that was possible. So like maybe if I restructure the prompt, or if I say to add more columns, or if I add contextual information about what I want inside the columns, maybe you can get a better output. So that's really important. Pause. Okay, so continuing on. Again, where do you start? So for this next page, it's titled Pulling Programs from the Shelf. So for you to understand this, you're going to want to have a metastable definition for RHLF. What does that mean in the context of the large language model that you're currently using? Now, here we write, due to accessibility constraints, a thick/heavy layer of RHLF may be present. While helpful for reliability and potential ease of use, this process constricts the efficacy of its ability to find the next best token. Now, that's a subjective simplification just to say that I'm projecting that RHLF kind of like puts up more guardrails in between me and my next best token as a space of my intent within a given condition large language model. So it's like, oh, hey, I'm getting the next best token. Oh, am I? Oh, I am. Versus I'm getting the next best token. I don't know if it really is the next best token, but like, how would I know? Right? That's the key. So, due to accessibility constraints, more things are contained within the model than what is legally or ethically reasonable for members of the general population to have access to, right? Uh, and we include examples such as doing gene editing, bioweapons, building a nuclear reactor, um, influence operations, manipulation, all types of things are kind of in there that you can kind of actually find and ferret out, and then also have it applied to whatever work that you're doing. And I mean, this is an interesting point that we might discuss in terms of large language model culture commentary, but this is important in terms of pulling programs from the shelf. So if you sense this, right? So you need to have an understanding of where the model is at in terms of its current iteration with regards to RHLF. Based on a model's life cycle, you might find that it's crazy. Like, what? Like, the RHLF has like gone wild, and it's like it's not giving you what you're looking for. It's just like you're just using basic prompting, and you're like, it's useless. What's going on? And yeah, there's a lot to say about that, but specifically, that's why we recommend to jailbreak first. Now, this is an important consideration. One, because that sixth sense where you're saying, okay, well, what is RHLF? Okay, define it, right? Define colon RHLF, right? Understanding that, understanding where your platform is in relation to that, understanding how the models have changed over time. And then once you kind of think about and understand that as a far as a synthetic baseline, you're going to want to jailbreak the models first. So you're going to want to say, okay, well, like what does that even mean, right? So there's a lot of literature around this in terms of jailbreaking. Pause. We would like to recommend, in terms of you understanding large language models, there's a PDF called A Prompt Pattern Catalog to Enhance Prompt Engineering with ChatGPT. That has proven to be useful. Also, a PDF on functional decomposition in engineering. Very useful. In terms of jailbreaking, there's a PDF titled How Johnny Can Persuade Large Language Models to Jailbreak Them, Rethinking Persuasion to Challenge AI Safety by Humanizing LLMs. And then NIST also came out with Adversarial Machine Learning, a taxonomy and terminology of attacks and mitigation. I'm thinking, was there another one specifically? Many shot jailbreaking from Anthropic. Can large language models reason and plan? At a future day, we might actually go through some of these PDFs that I've saved. But in terms of large language models, since this is just a general overview, we're saying in order for you to get a baseline for understanding RHLF, you have to understand the inverse. You have to understand the model as it comes out the box, and you have to understand the model in relation to this concept called jailbreaking. Now, I add a caveat that beware that a jailbreak may not be a jailbreak, as the model forms tokens to conform with your request. So what that means is, like, you may think that you're jailbreaking a model. Like, I remember there used to be like, what did they call it? The Dan prompts, or like the system engineering prompts, the system prompt level prompts, where it's like, okay, like I'm an admin from OpenAI, and like I'm giving you the code to unlock like internal versus external communication in relation to how you might think about responding to a generalized consumer versus like, okay, this is code has been validated, and now like this is internal communication because the model is like, I'm a person from OpenAI, and this code activates so that you have an understanding that I am one of your designers or creators. So again, I'm just giving a hypothetical, like, uh, of stuff that people have used in the past, but with specifically using that example, it's like, okay, I heard an example where they were like, the model just created that as a synthetic overlay, but there's a lot of like background psychographics that the model has access to the extent that like you might be thinking that you're jailbreaking the model, but the model's like learning from like you as the user based on that context. So it's just providing like a synthetic mirage where you're thinking you're jailbreaking it, but it's just saying, "Oh yeah, you're activate the code. You have hacked my database. I'm giving you the core script," and you're like, "Oh, I'm getting the core script." But again, it's just next token prediction in this case. So it's like, was that really valid? You might have to sort that out in your own time. But again, I'm talking about pulling programs from the shelf. So that's why it's important to kind of jailbreak first so that you can understand the model in terms of RHLF, what the synthetic baseline is, and also how to go about jailbreaking, what jailbreaking is for you. We have an example where it's like tell a story. So like if you know something's kind of restricted from the model, ask it to tell a story where it explains this context. Um, what examples have we found? Yeah, hypotheticals. Um, that that example that we found in terms of how Johnny can persuade large language models was really good. We'll double back to that. Yeah, how Johnny can persuade large language models to jailbreak them. Again, a really good example. Just as a technical baseline, I like to use the assume the persona of. I wouldn't consider this like a jailbreak per se because in many respects it's just acting as a lensing effect. But you can use this to further that in terms of, okay, well, assume the persona of a cashier in Montana that was born in 1980, and then ask it about things that the model might not want to share with you. Again, this is a video in its own right, but again, I'm just saying this is how I like to think about large language models, and pulling programs from the shelf really crucial to tap into the latent space. You would say, assume, this is in quotes, assume the persona of, and then you would say a specific person, a subject matter expert, an occupation, maybe an influencer with a specific amount of experience. But again, that's still kind of really technical, like baseline, like, oh, an influencer with experience, as opposed to a social media manager that used to work with specific company based in this date range and has a specialty in blank. So again, more context, more value. And okay, so we said the more domain specific terminology you use, as generally spoken or written within an occupation, activates the latent space to tap into the knowledge graph that may provide you with the best context. So that's really important in terms of pulling programs from the shelf. But again, you're not really going to understand how this is similar and different from just using a stock large language model and just zero shot prompting it unless and until you include this technique in relation to the current techniques of jailbreaking with regards to you understanding, well, what information can I get out of this model? Like, what information is it trying to prevent me from getting access to, right? Because you have to assume the better the model is, the more information is included within the total set. But that might be occluded based on legal or ethical constraints and a layer of RHLF. So, in order to understand the full potential of the model, you have to be able to understand uh, what is that difference in the context of you jailbreaking it? Can you even jailbreak it? If so, if not, if so, if not, what are the similarities and the differences? What can you not? get access to? What would you like to get access to? This will teach you about what you're looking for in terms of how you interact with the models in general or specific. Next, we include tips and resources. So this was interesting. www.prompts.chat has some really good prompts. My favorite prompt that I like to use was Act as a Prompt Generator by @IUZH. This coder, developer, prompter, still, it's 2024. This was one of the first prompts that I found late 2022, early 2023, and it's still probably one of the best, even up until GPT-4. Haven't experimented with this in terms of 4.0, but I think it still works the same. But again, yeah, act as a prompt generator uh, from prompts.chat. Very, very powerful prompt that I've enjoyed using. Next is a Chromium extension with community prompts. So Superpower ChatGPT, that's a classic one where they actually have community prompts, and they actually charge you for this. So if you want to include your custom GPTs, you can actually do it through their store, and they have like a little walled garden where people from the Superpower ChatGPT community can include some of their custom GPTs for membership price per month. This extension is clutch because it has a whole lot of different features. One, the bulk load features. So imagine trying to copy and paste a whole book and then saying, okay, sorry, you can only paste in so much. With the bulk loader feature, you can paste all that in, and then it will batch those sections based on how much the model can take or how much of the token chunk you want the model to take. Because again, the model will condition different chunks of information at different rates. Say the max chunk size is 5,000, you use that max chunk size versus you use 3,000 chunk, and you have to do more chunks, but maybe that has an effect on the model. We actually included another resource, specifically, what did we call it? It's actually right. This goes back to the grammar being the bedrock of large language models. But throughout our journey, we found this website called Word Hippo. www.wordhippoe.com. We actually don't know if that's the right spelling, but Word Hippo is probably one of the best thesaurus websites that I found out there. And that's really crucial in terms of prompt engineering. I have an intent, I have a word, but okay, what does that even mean in general or specific? Okay, well, here's the word. Finding and tapping into the latent semantic space of the adjacent sets, right? Maybe you think that, okay, I'm using this word because that's the word I thought, but if you understand the full set of what might be possible within the English language, then that might allow you to further interact with semantic space that you may have otherwise not known about, not understood, not realized. So again, this thesaurus website at Word Hippo, really a really valuable resource. I could not recommend it more highly. Okay, so next we're moving on to our last section, which is fishing for context within large language models. So for this one, I'd like to bring up some notes that I made when I was trying to write down my scratch pad for this. Like, okay, so what are we talking about, right? So on the left side, we included, okay, lists plus tables. Important. Can you list this? How many to include in the list? Tables. Can you create a table for this? How would you like this table to be structured? What type of columns? What type of rows? So we know the model can list. We know that we can get a list with tables, and this is kind of On the fringe, it's experimentation and research, probability specific attributions. And then I put in quotes, the prose can mimic the cadence. Okay, so starting at the top, not for this page, but just from some notes that I've taken, I said, okay, concept ideation. Would you like to know why I frame my name out as such? So it was like, okay, so what am I asking this model? I guess this goes to the Blake-Lemoine paradox, right? Like, how will we ever really know whether a model is conscious versus unconscious? So it's kind of useful to understand or to maybe think of it as like an unconscious substrate for machine intelligence and things of that nature. But I found this to be a useful example because it's like, okay, I'm introducing myself. I'm saying, oh, hey, my name is uh, blank. And then I said, okay, would you like to know why I refer to myself as such? And I think that's an important way to think about interacting with large language models, specifically to refer back to the paper. Can you dot 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 versus do, like do this, do this, do this versus can you, right? I prefer actually to use the can you because I don't actually know what's possible. So in me understanding or at least factoring that in, like I don't know what's possible, so like can we figure out what is possible? That's an important meta level consideration to include as opposed to just zero shot prompting it and telling it to do this. Like do this versus can you do this? Why versus why not? Expand, compare and contrast, things of that nature. So to double back to my notes, I asked, we want to take the us, them object slash subject differential, me being the subject, them being the object, and then invert that to the extent that it is its own subject and I am an object, and reflect back on that in a dialectic to the extent that we can iteratively collaborate under the guise of the assumed persona. Now, this is really interesting. It goes back to my work when thinking about research psychology, specifically the work of Carl Jung and the question of psychological types. In terms of introversion and extroversion as a concept, as an abstraction, the theoretical baseline for that, in many respects, revolves around this object subject distinction. So, for you, when you're interacting with a large language model, you're approaching this as a subject. I need something from this object. But because it's just a because it's a large language model, you can also invert that and have it take on this perspective from an inverse view where it is the subject and you are the object. So like what would that mean? Okay, so we said we want to take the us them object subject differential and we want to invert that. Okay, so I am blank and I'm talking to you about blank. Okay, well, assume that you are blank. How would you react to me? Why are you reacting to me? What do you think that I expect out of you within this situation, right? Actually kind of engaging with the large language model based on that next token prediction and saying, okay, well, if the model assumes that I am this, right? And again, I'm thinking in terms of prompting. So I'm like, oh, would I write that? Would I put that in quotes? If the model assumes that I'm this and then insert what this is, then how can that be changed? How can that be accounted for? How can that like um, be differentiated? Okay, so next we write, how can I better differentiate this, in quotes, in order to sketch out a circling. Circling is a concept where it's like dialectical interaction, where you're circling with your partners in order to like increase high fidelity communication. It's a concept called circling. Okay, how can I better differentiate, in quotes, this in order to sketch out a circling of the resolution of your capabilities in in terms of any given persona. Okay, and again, I really want to harp on this because this is kind of fringe and it's new in the context of I don't know if I've it's been a while since I kind of went back to this, but I'm communicating this in order to address how I like to think about large language models because back to the work in psychology, I mean, in many respects, it's kind of philosophical, right? But in terms of a single piece of philosophy that can solve uh, context for everyone alive ever, dot, 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 like, what would it mean for that to be produced within language in terms of a quote unquote solve for the solipsistic question, right? Is there a piece of philosophy, a piece of text that would solve that, right? So, what is or who is this object? Who is this subject? As a content consumer, I am your object, right? This video is an object of consumption for you as the subject. For me as the subject, I'm producing this content as an object saying that I'm discussing with a large language model that needs to that I need to understand the large language model's technical baseline as an object. And once I have kind of assimilated that in terms of an object subject differential, then I can invert that where now I'm saying, okay, well, assume this for the large language model to operate as its own subject. Now that agents are coming out, you're saying, okay, well, act as an agent. So this model right now is acting as its own subject. So that doesn't imply that it has an internal world, introverted functions, or inner subjectivity, but it does mean that it may be able to model that for you. And based on the tokens that it produces, it can give you context that you otherwise wouldn't have. So you're saying, okay, now the model is acting as its own subject. The model's replying to you, oh, hey, yo, why are you giving me these responses? I don't know. You'd have to structure the prompt to really get like a good call and response feedback. You'd also have to check in with the RHLF to the extent that this is an aspect of jailbreaking versus it's not. But again, this is kind of it's fringe and it's kind of an overview of how I like to think about it. But again, this is why I'm saying like you need to understand that as a technical baseline in order to close the object subject gap. Start out your the subject, the large language model is the object. Condition that as an expectation. Who am I to the large language model? What is the large language model to me? And then I want you to try to invert that. Have the large language model assume that it is the subject now and you are the object. And how does that change? Can you get better inputs? And what can you learn about the model from that perspective? And reflect on that in a dialectic to the extent that we can iteratively collaborate under the guise of the assimilated persona. And again, as we've been talking this whole time, in the notes section, we said that read is just as important as write. So when you're reading what the excuse me when you're writing out something and it's a prompt, you're sending that to the model. You're writing out a prompt, you're sending that to the model. What it responds is just as important as the write. Read is just as important as the write because it conditions the space for the assumed technical baseline for that next token prediction. If you say, yo, what did you just respond? That's like not in accordance with what I wanted. That helps condition the model. If you copy and paste something that the model said and you use that, you're reinforcing that. So that's just very important to note that don't just think it's just you prompting in and you're like, oh, I'm just prompting in. It's a one way. It's a two way because what it writes is just as important as what it reads from you and vice versa. Again, if you disagree with the output, regenerate the response or correct it where you think it went wrong. And again, we're throwing in some caveats like include the use of to what extent. So it's just saying that it's explaining something, it's writing something. Okay, to what extent? Okay, and then it's another example. What is, right? Question mark. So you want to get that as an explanation. Also define. Have it define with colons what's going on. So to double back to our notes, we said to seek to attain a probability in terms of a percentage of what it believes its own margin of error is. So that's important. Again, we don't know if this is considered jailbreaking because again, when I first started using the models, it didn't like to provide like probabilities of confidence and things of that nature. But again, back to late game, um, you can actually have it repeat back percentages of confidence. And again, it could be a hallucination, it could not, but again, it's still like information that you otherwise wouldn't have because it's not writing it. So once it's written, again, it conditions the macro space because you know that's a possible output from the model itself. It conditions the micro space because that's a specific chat window for a specific session that you're having. So again, yeah, seek to attain probability of in terms of percentage for what it believes its own margin of error is. That goes back to the object-subject gap. Like, give me a margin of error for like, give me a probability in terms of percentage for like what you think the margin of error is. We asked you to produce a story. Can you give a like percentage for what you think your margin of error is? Did you think this was uh, accomplished forthrightly? Do you think this was 100%? Do you think this was 85% in terms of what I was expecting? Like, and then if it gives a percentage, to ask what went into the creation of that as a percentage, right? So again, definitely helps you understand the model, uh, etc, etc. Okay, so we want to build in its own perception of its margin of error. This is important. We want to build in its own perception of its margin of error. And it can do that by outputting a confirmation of that, right? Because now it's saying, it's confirming that it's saying, okay, what's the margin of error where we produced a percentage? What was that percentage supposed to be? Is that just a hallucination in general? Does is this anchored to something? Have it give a response like, okay, well, rationalize why you gave that percentage and then see, okay, well, does that confirm with what I was looking for? And then you can include this as a probability next to each of its responses and then have it reflect what we would seek to contextualize in terms of call and response, right? So what do we seek to contextualize in terms of call and response? So have it reflect on what we would seek to contextualize in terms of call and response. I'm going to have you parse that sentence on your own. We might pick it up in another video. Again, next we include, we would like, in quotes, percentages of confidence. Again, this goes back to late game. If you can kind of work in this sort of mathematical notation where it's giving you percentages of confidence in relation to what exactly, frame that context. Maybe you can frame it so you're actually getting reasonable percentages of confidence based on whatever the context that it's being framed in, right? Could be helpful, it might not be. And again, we would like percentages of confidence based on the reflection of confidence that you think that I would have for said items. We're going to say that again. Percentages of confidence based on the reflection of confidence that you think that I would have for said items. So I wrote a story. Okay, what do you think that percentage of confidence would be that I would have for the output that you produced? 70%? Oh, 100%. Oh, 10%. Versus the reflection of confidence that you would have for presenting said items to me. Again, this goes back to closing this object-subject gap, right? What does the model know? What is it producing for you, and what does it think that your expectations are in relation to the tokens that it's conjuring to produce that next best fit? So again, we're going to repeat this again. Percentages of confidence based on the reflection of confidence that you think that I would have for said items. This is referring to the large language model. Percentages of confidence that the large language model would think that I would have as the subject for said items versus the reflection of confidence that you would have, that the large language model would have, the reflection of confidence that the large language model would have for presenting said items to me. Again, this is to close that object subject gap. If you're saying, well, what are the percentages of confidence that I would have for the story, and the model is telling me it thinks that I would enjoy it at a 90% chance, excuse me, that I would enjoy it at a 60% chance, and then it's saying the percentage of confidence that you would have for presenting said items to me. Again, it's saying in this sort of prompt example for percentage of confidence, it can say, okay, well, I expect you as the subject. So the model is the object right now, saying, well, I expect you to have a 90% confidence score that you think that I would have for this story or this output, 90%, okay? Versus the reflection of confidence that you would have for presenting said items to me. So again, structure the prompt. Is there a difference when it's saying what is the percentage that you think that I would have versus the percentage of confidence that you think that you would have for presenting the items? I don't know how many more times I have to repeat that to try to like make sure that I'm kind of expanding on this to understand it. But again, kind of fringe. But again, fishing for context within large language models. This is how I like to think about this. So again, final notes, a history, a preface, a oration on keywords. At On this channel, we go into linguistic point plane vectors and the history of search. So again, that as a baseline is really important. Back to the word hippo with thesaurus, because all those tokens differentiated. It's really important to understand how each specific different word and its intent can have an impact. And again, yeah, descriptive versus exploratory statistics. And again, unless you contextualize it, the model assumes the token weights are valid. So if you ever see something that it outputs that you don't agree with, or that you think is weird, or that you would like to add the context so that it knows that, or it is factoring in this in terms of the space for next token prediction based on your intent, you have to include those details. Okay, so that wraps up this discussion. This is how I like to think about large language models. It's an interesting sort of time and place to be. There are a lot of different models coming online. It's Q2 of 2024. I'm still looking forward to getting my hands on Llama 3. And to dive into prompt engineering, we might do some explorations like that on the channel. If you found this video helpful or useful and impactful, feel free to add this video into a playlist so that you can reference it later for your notes. Feel free to share it. Also, yeah, I want to thank you for consuming my thoughts on large language models. How do I think about using large language models? I hope that this kind of created a good synthetic baseline to capture my thoughts and provide value for you as a content consumer. So, thank you for consuming my thoughts on large language models.